Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Since I see new faces tonight, I would like to begin by a brief recap of the major points that I mentioned last night, so that the other issues that I address make sense, they are interconnected. I began by stating that every faith, at the beginning of it, at the beginning or at the point of inception, has come to challenge the status quo and the prevailing social order. Otherwise, there would not be any need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send a messenger. If the social structure in a society is acceptable, then there is no need for a messenger with a message that is going to change. So every faith at the beginning of its history, it comes to liberate. What happens to it after is the critical issue. By its nature, once the faith is considered to be liberating, it puts the faith and the religion in a direct confrontation with the prevailing social, political, and economic structure. The faith wants to create a more homogeneous kind of structure within a society, which we call it concept of justice, social justice, economic justice to be prevailed. Those who have vested interest in the safekeep of the old justice, they want that justice to continue because they benefit from it. There is what I call the classic formulation in which the power that exists responds to the new faith. And normally, broadly speaking, there are three steps. Number one, it responds with force to frighten the new faith and weaken the new convert to the community. Brute force. And we see this in the early history of at least the three major monotheistic religions that we are familiar with: Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. How the structure responds normally follows this three pattern. First force, killing the new followers, the new community, weakening it, destroying it. If it doesn't work, the next step is what we call paying off and buying and bribing the new, be it the new prophet, the new converts, to move them away. Sometimes it's a combination of both power. I mentioned last night that Marhum Dr. Shariati calls it zur, zar, and tazwir. Power, zar, wealth, and then deceit. These three normally factors that come together. What will happen if even the second approach fails? Particularly in the case of Islam, we don't have in either Judaism, Jewish history, or Christian history, a direct confrontation in which, say, Prophet Isa alayhi salam takes over the temple. It doesn't exist. Or Prophet Musa alayhi salam is able to control the whole social and political structure that existed before. Its unique character of Islam, that on the 8th year of after Hijrah, the Prophet of Islam was able to come back and conquer Mecca, which was the base of what we call polytheistic understanding and idol worshippers, and constituted the political, economic center of the opponent of the faith. It's unique to Islam. Now, once the power to be finds itself in such a position, to use the narrative, it goes underground. What does it mean to go underground? It waits for an opportune moment where it can come back and take the religion in a non-linear way, in which the entire cultural as well as political establishment of the old come back to dominate the society, but in a different cloak. Which means now they pray, they fast, they go to the mosque. But the essence, the spirit of the religion is the same old classical approach to clan mentality, power structure, etc. And I also mentioned that in correct analysis of history, we really need to be mindful of a number of issues, number of factors. Number one, our history is informed by revelation. Revelation constitutes the foundation of our history. That's number one. Number two, our history, our analysis of history is God-centric, where everything, concept of Tawheed, at least in the Shia Kalam and Shia theological understanding, concept of Tawheed dictates everything. It's the foundation of everything. We may differ with some school of theology as far as their interpretation of what the meaning, or the true meaning of Tawheed, but Tawheed in the Kalam or theology of Shia constitute the foundation of everything. Everything is God-centered. We have to be mindful of, when we come to the analysis of history or assessment of the old historical events, not to lose sight of this critical issue. Number three, no historical event should be reduced to a singular piece, which is analyzed independent of its factors and linkage. To give you an example, in the post-occupation of Iraq in particular, the occupying forces came up not looking at the consequence of occupation on the balance of power that existed in Iraq, particularly creating the social strife. The excuse that they came up with was, well, this is classical Shia-Sunni issue. It exonerates the occupier from accepting part of the blame. Yes, Shia and Sunni in history, they may have had a problem, but for somehow a balance was reached, that you come back and you break the social fabric of the society, and then a new boundary of character and identity has to be redefined. Then you say, well, it is the old Shia-Sunni issue. That is one excuse given. The second excuse, those who work in the international relation and social science kind of field, they say, well, it is something to do with the nation state. The nation state was imposed on the Middle East. The British Empire came in and arbitrarily drew the line here and there. It didn't consider and take into account the fact that now, once you draw a line and divide people, it has consequences. Again, that's another version of the same old story, exonerating themselves. Part of this analysis is the reduction of history into a small piece, where it breaks it away from the historical linkage. I taught a class last quarter, Arab Spring, and one day a student of mine came in and brought a book written by Leslie Hazelton. The title of the book is After the Prophet, the story of the Shia-Sunni split in Islam. She is a Jewish author. She's been writing about Middle East issues. She is relatively aged and mature, that one has to expect from her a better approach. But in her analysis of the so-called split between Shias and Sunnis, she goes back to the issue of Karbala and considered what happened, the massacre of Karbala, to be the issue, the singular issue that divides Shias and Sunnis, as if nothing happened before. Unfortunately, this approach is a gross oversimplification of history, because events feed into each other. Let me give you an example. Use it as a metaphor if you wish. I lived for many years in England, and in 1978 the Conservative Party came to power. The first law that they passed was that they banned anyone coming from Indian subcontinent, from India, to United States. To United Kingdom. There was a rally, a demonstration by people from India in front of Parliament. But one placard said it all. A young lady was holding a placard, said, "We are here because you were there." This is the linkage of history. You can't bring people from Indian subcontinent, use them as cheap labor, and then arbitrarily decide that as if from tomorrow nothing is not going to happen. It creates its own momentum. Ashura and the history of Karbala must be analyzed and understood in the light of the linkages and the factors that fed into this reality. I left you with a question last night, asking you to explain this particular issue. What happened, or what was wrong with the Muslim society of, say, 50 years after the demise of the Holy Prophet? Only 50 years. What was wrong with the social fabric of the Muslim society at that time that needed such a drastic step to be taken, where grandson of the Holy Prophet had to sacrifice himself and his close disciple for the sake of correction? This is the critical issue. For the sake of correction. The society that during the life of the Prophet, the verse in the Holy Quran says, "Kuntum khayru ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas." The exemplary ummah and social structure that humanity can have suddenly accepts the slaughtering of the grandson of the Holy Prophet without anybody blinking, as something normal. What went wrong with such a society? This is what I call the existential question. To be able to understand it, what we need to do is to look back to the historical factors, the gradual movement from before Islam into Islam, and ultimately into the point where the seat of power that used to be occupied by the Prophet, a shifty character like Muawiyah occupies it, and nobody says anything. Muawiyah comes after the battle with Imam Hassan in Kufa, and the peace deal is made. He comes to Masjid al-Kufa, goes up the minbar, and stands behind the podium that only a few months ago Ali used to stand there and deliver the sermon. and recite and performs Salat al-Jum'ah in Wednesday, not Jum'ah. And the entire Muslim community sheepishly follow. They perform Salat al-Jum'ah on Wednesday and nobody asks questions. And then he goes and delivers a sermon. O people of Kufa, I did not fight with you because I wanted you to pray or fast. You're already doing it. I fought with you to take full control. The power is concept of power. Those who understand in the major theories in international relations, one of them is the realist theory that defines everything in terms of power. Bani Umayyah used to use this way before Locke, Hobbes or anybody else developed it in the West. The concept is purely power. Where do they get this idea from? It comes from the culture that prevailed and dominated the Quraysh and the Mecca society before Islam. Without that analysis and understanding, we really can't come and say suddenly Saqifa happened. No, nothing in history happened suddenly. The events are step-by-step, gradual movement until it reaches a point where a shift takes place. Only 25 years later, after the death or assassination of Uthman, Ali is asked to become the Khalif. The first sermon that he delivers clearly defines the policy of this new administration. But he reminds his audience at the time that Allah inna baliyatukum qad aadat. The problem that the Holy Prophet used to deal with before Islam has come to dominate the social structure of the Muslim only 25 years after the demise of the Holy Prophet. Year 35 after Hijrah. And for me, even Amir al-Mu'mineen talks about correction. I'm going to change the social structure in a way that I will turn the up will have to be down and the down will have to be up. This change was quite clear to Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Hassan, and especially Imam Hussein. Where does this idea come from? We have to search the beginning of it, at least in the pre-Islamic structure of Quraysh and the Arab society in Arabian Peninsula. The social structure, particularly when you add it with the harsh ecosystem, created and imposed a nomadic lifestyle, tribal, that not only isolated them, the lifestyle insulated them from the two major civilizations that dominated the area around. It was the Byzantine Roman civilization in the north part, covered the Levant and the Syria today, etc. And the northeast, it was the Persian civilization. Apart from minor civilization on the south, which now we call it Yemen, really in the middle, the whole desert area, apart from few towns, oases at the time, there was no major of civilization for the community that existed before Islam. Tribal structure that had its own hierarchy and its own way of dealing with each other. The issue of power and wealth came to dominate. Even in cities, and this is why we constantly see them fighting each other. Aus and Khazraj in Medina, although the Jewish community over there fed into this strife, but at least these two tribes fought each other for decades, if not centuries. All to dominate the area that they wanted to live in. In even major cities like Mecca, we had this strife between one tribe and another. On the one hand, we had Bani Hashim, which they could trace their ancestral link to Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ. And then we had other part or offshoot of the same tribe, like Bani Umayyah. because of the respect that people had for Bani Hashim under its charismatic leaders were able to create a structure in which what we call delegation of responsibilities. Each tribe was given something so that later on there will not be conflict. Bani Umayyah were given, if we want to use a narrative of what we call current administration or administrative kind of policy, the Bani Umayyah were given the Ministry of Defense. And they were responsible for leading all the battles against Mecca and Quraysh. And particularly the leader of this community was Abu Sufyan. If you read the early history of Islam, probably the one that was the strongest and the vilest enemy of Islam was Abu Sufyan. It led practically all the battles about Islam, with Islam. Battle of Badr, Uhud was participant, Khandaq, and so on and so forth. So the classic formulation is something that Bani Umayyah used to destroy Islam. First with power, then wealth. They decided to use their wealth to see whether they can bribe Muslim members away from the community. Ultimately, they found themselves on the 8th year of Hijrah with the army of Islam walking into Mecca, their central power base. Everybody expected, well, that Bani Umayyah will be wiped out as the center of opposition to the new system. The Holy Prophet, based on his infinite wisdom and love and compassion, decided to forgive them. What happened was that now Bani Umayyah finds itself in a new, what we call, equation of power. Never, Bani Umayyah, we see this repeatedly being mentioned, never in the history of their life Bani Umayyah accepted Islam as a faith. They always looked upon Islam as a trick by Bani Hashim to destabilize the balance of power and take control. We see in the debate when Abu Sufyan is blind during the reign of Uthman. He comes into the office one day and Ali is sitting there. Somebody asks him, or father of Khalid or whatever, what do you think about the reign of Uthman? Uthman is from Bani Umayyah. He said, the ball is now in your court, O Bani Umayyah. Do not allow the power to come out of your hand. Otherwise, there was no faith, there was no religion, there was nothing else. It's purely power game. This is Abu Sufyan. You may say, well, this might have been Abu Sufyan's views. During Muawiyah, when he was in charge in Sham, and he was asked, why such an animosity towards Ahlul Bayt? He said, I'm not going to settle until I wipe the name of Muhammad out of the face of the earth. Yazid's comment when the head of Hussein is in front of him and says, لَيْتَ أَجْدَادِي بِبَدْرٍ شَهَدُوا, or I wish my grandparents that lost their lives in Badr would have been alive to see the success, the revenge of everything that had happened. It's not a new, somehow unique idea that Yazid created for himself. It's part of a pattern, historical pattern, that the beginning of it goes back from to before Islam. So it's really hard when you analyze this to understand how can one stand and say, well, our leader Yazid killed our leader Hussein, and both of them, God will forgive their sins, and they both are going to go to heaven. If we consider Bani Umayyah to be, a tribe that to the last minute of their life, they never accepted Islam, they were not prepared to comply with the Islamic rule, and they were adamant that they have to do everything possible to destroy Islam. And this idea is repeated again. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, after Yazid's son abdicated, Muawiyah II abdicated, says, my father Yazid committed the most heinous of crime, I'm not prepared to accept this leadership. Walks away. Who comes? The second branch of Bani Umayyah, under the leadership of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. This is the same guy that the Holy Prophet expelled from Medina and considered him and his father to be a curse as long as they live in Medina for the entire Muslim community. What happened to him? Uthman comes to power, brings him back, rewards him with 100,000 pieces of gold as a compensation for a period of exile. Gives him his daughter and then puts him in charge of Baytul Mal. The whole economic power of Islamic State is in his hand. Now Marwan becomes the Khalif, Khalifatul Muslimin. He dies within few years. His son Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is sitting in the mosque and reciting Quran. The news comes to him that his father is dead and now he is the new caliph. He shuts the book, and this is, by the way, recorded in all historians, both Shia and Sunni. Shuts the book and says, هَذَا فِرَاقٌ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكَ. My path and your path from now on are separated from each other. No wonder we get to the point that the third Imam feels that it is necessary to begin a revolution that fundamentally shifts and changes the whole fabric of the social structure. There is an expression that Amir al-Mu'mineen sallallahu alayhi uses it in Nahj al-Balagha, that people who detach themselves from this unique concept of God-centric and Tawheed become dead that are walking around. The Muslim society became a dead society that performed ritualistic action, prayers, fasting, Hajj, and everything else. The spirit was dead. Hussein wanted to, talks about Islah, to literally kick it to come back to the right path. Inshallah, I've already passed the 25 minutes. We continued discussing this. No analysis of Islamic history can take place, correct analysis, without addressing these fundamental issues and what we call in the narrative of academia contextualization. Put it into the context. Who's doing what? Under what circumstance? What are the reasons? Where the idea comes from? Then history makes sense. Otherwise, it becomes just parrot-style repetition of the historical event without clear understanding of something. Last night I asked that everyone asks a question or writes a question, and we try to spend a few minutes, 10-15 minutes to answer them. Please don't write 6 or 7 questions. One question per person, thank you very much, because then one has to really make a choice of which one to answer. Yes. ask one question. So what I'm going to do, if the sisters are prepared to write few questions, I'm going to separate these to balance. I will answer one question from the brothers, and then I go to the sisters, one question from the sisters. And then we go forward. We have about 10 minutes in total. So let us start with the first question from the sisters, or a few questions from the sisters. Well, let's start with the first question here from the brother's side. What is the way forward for the Shia and Sunnis to coexist after recent and continuous poisoning of the relationship? Is there a parallel in history that we can learn from? Example, Catholics and Protestants, etc., etc. Shia and Sunni, leaving the issue, the theological issue aside, as basic human beings, they can coexist. It's what we call the external factors that uses the theological issue for their benefit. We see this, at least the foundation of it, or the basis of it during the Bani Umayyah period. Even we can go before. We see it in the way the second Caliph talks and deals with Arabs and non-Arabs, because he thought that there is a tendency where non-Arabs have more inclination towards Ahlul Bayt than Arabs at the time. It's the political, the contingent political issues that really plays the role here. Unfortunately, in the past, there were periods in which Shias and Sunnis had their own conflict. But there were shrewd and wise leaders that understood the negative consequences of this infighting. It weakens the whole community, irrespective of Sunnis and Shias. At least from 18th century, the colonial powers came back to play the major role that in the past, say, Khulafa bin al-Abbas or Khulafa bin al-Umayyah or other people used to play, with the clear intention of weakening the Muslim community under the umbrella of divide and rule. In Indian subcontinent, they created a number of semi-religious or new groups. In Iran, they did it. In Arabia, they did it. One of the major classic challenge that we have today is Wahhabism and Salafi movement. Even the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for a while, was not anti-Shia, but somehow in the post-Arab Spring and the election and coming to power of Morsi and a few others, there was a clear demarcation from the old approach of Muslim Brotherhood by creating a collaborative effort with Turkey, as well as Qatar and a few other places, to create what they call the crescent, the Sunni crescent, to defeat Iran or neutralize Iran, Shia, and Iraq. With the fall of Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood, the dominant power is Saudi Arabia. And right from its original inception, the Saudi role has been, or the Wahhabi role has been, to divide the Muslim community. Sectarian violence, separation between various communities, huge wealth gives them the opportunity to do it. To the point that now, today, even in the United States, if they manage to get into the board of a mosque, very quickly they poison the environment. I remember in Colorado, during the old Imam of the mosque, we were so close that I went to the mosque, Sunni mosque, and we had conversation, dialogues, and worked together. The moment the Wahhabis took over, completely changed. I can't even go close to the mosque anymore, let alone the Imam of the mosque inviting me or calling. The new Imam constantly talks as if we don't have anything else to do, no major issues in the world, but Shia Sunni issues. They are kafir, they are mulhad, you should be killed, and so on. Even Shia Americans that went to Hajj, it was on YouTube and Facebook, they were insulted by the Takfiri and Wahhabi and Salafis in broad daylight. We will kill you and take your wives and your wealth as booties. This is the reality that we have to deal with. So, yes, other faith, Catholic and Protestant movement, even one group of, say, Orthodox and the renewed movement within Judaism may dislike each other's theological point of view. But they are prepared to work based on the commonality for the sake of creating a unity. Unfortunately, these people are not prepared to do anything. So when you talk about dialogue, there must be at least a basic respect for the other side, for you to be able to sit and talk. If you look at the history of Wahhabism up to 1970s, even Marhum al-Hakim, rahmatullah alayhi, when Shia scholars used to go to Saudi Arabia for Hajj, theological conversation took place between scholars of Wahhabi Islam and scholars of Shia Islam. Each one presented their own point of view, and they separated, we agree to disagree. There is a shift in 1970 into a more radical approach as part of the power structure that Saudis to control the rest of the world and dictate information, etc., etc. So, yes, I worked probably 20, 30 years in interfaith dialogue, both in England and here. But I don't see at this stage that basic requirement for sitting together. If the other side says that I have to kill you, that ends the conversation. There is no basic, no conversation takes place if you are going to approach such a poisonous relationship. That I sit with Catholics, I sit with Protestants, I worked with the Episcopal Church, I worked with other churches and rabbis as well as others in Colorado because there was a mutual respect. We may disagree on the issue of Palestine, we may disagree on a few concept of God, but we can work on what we call social issues together, more practical issues together. And we stood side by side, solidarity worked. These people are not prepared to do that. So how on earth I would develop a methodological approach to have conversation with them, I find it very difficult. There is a question from the sister. Some Shia sisters and brothers go and send their kids to Sunni school. What is your opinion about it? During the time that I lived in England, Dr. Karim Siddiqui, the head of Muslim Parliament, researched the effect of what we call secular state, secular education on children's mind. The conclusion was that for every hour that the child spends, and by the way, there is a document, if you go back to 1980s, Muslim Parliament's research document still exists. For every hour that the child spends in what we call a secular education environment, Parents need 2 hours to brainwash them back to where they used to be before. Now, here is the question. 8 hours a day, even if we want to be optimistic, say 1 hour for 1 hour. How many of us are prepared to spend 8 hours a day with our quality time with our children to negate what the brainwashing that has taken place may not be direct, implicit, but to correct this correction methodology on a regular basis? We don't have it. I personally prefer the children to go to such schools. At least the basic ideas can be taught. One could work with the kids. Look, our understanding is this, our understanding is that, our analysis of history is this, our analysis of history is that, as you have to do if your child goes to a Christian secular state or anywhere else. The notion that somehow the Sunni school has a unique or creates a unique problem, no. Living in the West, it's part and parcel of what we call trade-off. You either are prepared to sit down at home, and this is, some families are doing it. The mother or the father stays at home to look after and educate the child. One partner goes out to earn a living. But if the economic circumstance forces you both partners to go out, you're already at a disadvantage, irrespective of whether your child goes to a secular state, religious school, religious Catholic or Protestant, or say Sunni school. The ideal situation is when you have, say, our own faith, a school that plans for the upkeep and upbringing of our children. In the absence of such reality, what should we do? We have to compromise. But again, it's our responsibility as parents. We have to be mindful of the environment which is going to be created. I was in Canada between 1996 and 1997, and this was one of the challenges for Shia community over there. Until the Lebanese community organized a school for themselves, and then Iraqis, most people send their families to a Sunni school. They had no other alternative. But they were vigilant in a sense that when the kids came home, there was a clear program in which parents sat and had conversation with the children. The notion that where we used to live, whether it was Iraq, Iran, somewhere in the Middle East, the kid went to school, came back home, did his or her own thing, the society collaborated or cooperated in the upbringing of the child, doesn't exist. You are at a disadvantage the moment the child is conceived, not even born. If it corrupts the adult, it certainly would corrupt the children. During the inception, as the child develops, what are we doing as far as our relationship? We watch TV. We listen to a number of things. All this affects the fetus. So the child is at a disadvantage even at the moment of conception. We have to be mindful of the reality outside. I look forward to the day where the wealthy and the intellectuals within our community, whether this community or any other community, can come together and work for the betterment, have a plan for 10 years from now and say, okay, inshallah, we will have, as you have heard that you had it before, we have a school, we have a social club, we have university, etc., etc., etc. That's the ideal circumstance. But even in the ideal circumstance, it does not exonerate you from your responsibilities. You still have a responsibility before yourself and your children. Unfortunately, my 10 minutes is up. So I only managed to deal with one question from, I hope brothers and sisters would not kind of feel bad about it, but I collect all these trophies Inshallah, one day I'll write a book and respond to these questions. Let's change channel. Now we switch from English into Farsi. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرضين بأبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين واللعن الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام